Hi, everybody. Welcome to our last Kavli conversation on science communication of the semester. Uh, I am just, I just could not be more thrilled that we will not be talking about COVID or presidential transitions. But we will be talking about something that is really interesting and topical and newsy and important in a very different way, and that is looking for life elsewhere in the universe besides this very challenged planet where we live right now. And we have a wonderful group of discussants, and we very much want to encourage you to participate. And please do so using the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you use the chat, we will not necessarily see it. So definitely use the Q&A. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Dan Fagan. I'm a science journalism professor here at New York University. And my program, the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program, sponsors this discussion series along with the Kavli Foundation. And you will be able to watch this discussion on tape or on video, as well as all of the other previous Kavli conversations that we've had by going to the web at journalism.nyu.edu/KC. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Miriam Cramer, who is a terrific journalist who covers the space beat and has for years now. She's currently the space reporter at Axios. She puts out the Axios Space newsletter. Before that, she was the science editor, and before that at Mashable, and before that a science reporter at Mashable. And before that, she was a staff writer at space.com, so she really knows her space issues. And before that, well, she was a student at the NYU SHIRT program, and really an awesome student. And I'm not the least bit surprised that she's been so incredibly successful, because she was a terrific student. So Miriam is going to be our moderator tonight, and I will sort of disappear, but I'll be listening avidly and participating later. But for now, I will turn it over to Miriam to introduce our guests.
Hi, thanks, Dan. That was very kind of you. So I have two really amazing panelists tonight. So Rebecca Boyle is a science writer. She covers the space beat. She's one of the people that I love to read the most. So I'm very happy that she's here today. She's written for The Atlantic, The New York Times, The New Yorker, and a myriad of other places. And she is in the process of writing a book about the moon at the moment that should be out sometime in the next year or so. Depending, we'll see. Yeah. And then we also have David Grinspoon joining us, who is a fantastic science communicator, astrobiologist, and a really great source for anyone looking for someone who wants to talk about life on other planets. And he has also written books. He's a couple ones that I have delved into were Venus Revealed and Chasing New Horizons, which is about the New Horizons mission to Pluto. So thank you guys both for being here. I guess to start with, I would love to hear just a little bit about each of your stories for sort of how you ended up on kind of the space beat and working on this kind of wild beat that all of us have found ourselves adjacent to in some way or another. So Rebecca, if you want to start.
Sure. So I guess my origin story in this beat is that I went to space camp when I was in 6th grade and wanted to be an astronaut, but then quickly realized that was going to be really hard and if not impossible. So kind of pivoted. And I actually have a degree in history, and I worked for newspapers before I went freelance almost 12 years ago now. And I covered politics and courts and sort of normal small town government stuff, but this has always been my first love. And so I would just read Dennis Overby stories in the New York Times and be wistful about wanting to write about dark matter and, the big crunch and all these different things. And then was sort of thrust into freelancing in 2009. And then started writing for Popular Science. That's where I kind of became a freelancer. They were kind enough to give me lots of assignments. Then I just kept asking for more, and they kept giving me more. And then suddenly years had gone by, and I was still doing this. And so that's kind of where I am now. I'm in coverage, and yeah, I've been very fortunate that it's worked out so far.
That's great. And David?
Well, my origin story begins in a kind of cliche but very true way, which is that I'm a child of Apollo, in that literally, one of my earliest memories is I was in the 4th grade when Neil and Buzz stepped off the lander, and it's one of my earliest memories, and it was just thrilling. And so as a kid, that was the thing that excited me the most. And the first missions were going to Venus and Mars and to the outer solar system, when I was growing up. And I have just a lot of vivid memories of being enthralled with all that. It might have helped that my dad's best friend was Carl Sagan, and he was Uncle Carl was around the house a lot, and that was definitely an influence. But I'm not one of these people that had to sort of figure out my path after going a lot of different directions. I was a space head from a young age, and I went to college and studied planetary science and got summer jobs working as research assistant on the Viking mission, and then on Voyager, and got to attend some of the Voyager encounters as a student, which were incredible experiences. So it's pretty much a straight path, undergraduate, grad school, postdoc, faculty job. And then my story gets a little weird, because I ended up being a museum curator and working for a research nonprofit, and then being a chair of astrobiology at the Library of Congress.
Wow.
So I've had sort of an unusual string of jobs, but all kind of launching from that being a space nut and getting a PhD in planetary science, and then kind of riding the astrobiology wave when astrobiology became a respectable thing from a fringe thing. I was sort of just really beginning my career. So then I was like, well, of course I'm an astrobiologist along with everybody else now. So that's my story.
No, that's really interesting. I'm actually curious how you ended up sort of wanting to write books and wanting to sort of do a lot of public communication, because that's sort of how I got to know you, was initially from just like seeing your work on Twitter and just in general.
Yeah, well, I mean, as a kid, and now I'm talking about, as a high school student, really, I was really inspired by scientists who were good communicators. Obviously, Sagan was a role model, but also Lewis Thomas and Rachel Carson. And, I just thought it was really cool that there were scientists who were doing science, but could also write these amazing books that opened up worlds for other people. And I kind of aspired for that. So I did. Even though I was a science student, as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, I took writing courses. And it was always something I realized it was a craft in addition to something that could be excited about. And I worked on it. And then I wrote some stories for magazines when I was in grad school. And then I kind of lucked into my first book contract, because an editor saw a magazine article that I wrote and came to me and said, "Do you want to do a book?" And I was like, "Sure." And then that, one thing led to another. And then, I did end up as a museum curator, where my job was kind of 50-50 research and communication, which I feel was kind of lucky. It's hard to find those niches where for a lot of scientists, the communication stuff still feels like something you sort of squeeze in on the side and you can get away with. But I've had a couple of jobs where it was actually part of my job to do that in addition to doing the science.
That's cool. That's really cool. So I guess to sort of jump in, first of all, if anyone has just joined, if you have any questions, please drop them into the Q&A, and I'll kind of filter them in and ask them as we go. So to start with, we kind of wanted to do basically a bit of a case study because this year has seen a particularly exciting moment in astrobiology, I would say, that could kind of shape the future of missions that are being planned right now and being sent out there at some point. So in September, there was a Nature Astronomy study, I believe, that basically claimed to have found a signal of phosphine on Venus in the clouds of the planet. And it got a lot of traction. It was a big deal. It was heralded as a possible sign of life. And it was one of those sort of splashy moments that kind of broke through from space to science to everybody, I would say. I think it was a pretty big week on the beat. So I guess all three of us sort of had very different, I would say, experiences of this particular discovery. So Rebecca, I would love to hear a little bit about sort of how you first found out about it, and then sort of where your mind went and how that kind of looked for you.
So, okay, so I, with the, statement that I did not write about this study, partly on purpose. I read about it in the Nature Astronomy email that comes to reporters. The little Nature press pack sends like a little list of stuff coming out in the embargoed journals. And I saw this, I think this was the first thing in there. And I was immediately like, oh, okay, like that would be amazing. And that would be an extraordinarily important finding if it were real. And I went right to arsenic life in my mind, which the background on this is that I think around 2011, maybe 2010 or 11, there was a pretty heavily funded and heavily reported NASA study looking at life forms in Mono Lake, which is in California. And it's a highly saline lake. And David, correct me if I'm wrong about any of these details, but the study was looking at whether the organisms that live in this water of this lake could uptake arsenic and survive and metabolize it in a way that would be equivalent to something like using carbon or the other molecules that are the backbone of life. And it would be an extraordinary finding because it would be like this unknown sort of life that would never have been found anywhere else on Earth up to that point. It would suggest that extremophiles, these life forms that live in extreme environments, can come in flavors that we'd never imagined, and that life could exist using this poison as its as its product, and that's really unusual. And so it was widely covered, and then it was widely panned immediately after. And I felt sort of sorry for the scientist because it felt like she was sort of caught up in this firestorm of whether this was a null result or not. And she was pretty young, she was earlier career, and it felt unfair to me how she was treated by NASA and by some of the other establishment and by some of the media. And it became this fiasco that lasted months and reverberated in the scientific community for a couple of years. And it was an extraordinary claim. And that's the first thing my mind went to when I saw this phosphine result, because similarly, phosphine can be a byproduct of some form of metabolism. It's usually only found that way on Earth. And so it would be, interesting to see that somewhere else. And it could be an indicator that something else is metabolizing or respiring on that planet. But that's a lot of ifs. And the math that they performed to reach this level of certainty was super convoluted. And I don't pretend to even understand how they figured out this 12th order polynomial, which is a way of doing algebra that cancels out noise, essentially. It is extremely complex, and it just seemed really, I was unsure, and I was like, this is going to be a really hard story to write well, because it's going to be so complicated and the controversy is so important, but it's going to get lost in the headline. And and I think it did in a lot of ways, and I think the space people who covered this did a really good job. But because it's such an extraordinary claim, it was international news, and people were really excited, and people got really invested really quickly, and it became kind of like arsenic life. And then all of a sudden, right away, people were like, oh no, this signal is not strong enough, and your math is messy, and the model fitting is maybe a little questionable, and then the data was pulled down and re-scrubbed, and this is how science is supposed to work, but that's not in all the coverage. And very few people have followed up on this because very few outlets are covering it again, because it's sort of like, this is the science process. It's supposed to be packed. It's supposed to be put under a microscope and pulled apart, and that's really hard to write about. And so I was kind of like, I'm just not gonna write about that. I didn't have that much time anyway that week, and that was fine. But I was kind of like, oh, I don't know, I'm nervous.
So funny. I will just say our experience of it is so hilariously different to me, because for me it was like I got the Nature press release, and then I got the MIT press release, which is really, I think, what set off most of what we all saw, with the sort of hype machine just turning on. Because that press release was very definitive, and it was really interesting how people interpreted it. And I devoted the entire space newsletter to the Venus discovery, partially because of timing, because it came out on a Monday. My newsletter goes out on Tuesdays, and I was like, perfect, ideal, we'll do it that way. And it was interesting. I mean, I talked to like 10 people for the stories. Like, a lot of people really reported the hell out of it. And I think it was, a lot of folks got it really right, and a lot of folks got it really wrong, and a lot of folks broke the embargo.
Yes.
That was a really interesting moment too, waiting that weekend to see if they would lift the embargo on all of us. But yeah, no, so David, I'm sure you had a very different experience than we did.
I did, but it's really interesting to me hearing about your experiences, and I'm really interested in what Rebecca had to say, because it's interesting to me how the arsenic life story kind of did precondition, I think, a lot of people's reactions to this story, and we could talk about whether that was a good thing or not. People might almost like sort of been over careful because of arsenic, I think, because I mean, well, so, but to back up and tell you how I first heard about it, because that's what you asked, Miriam. It's interesting because as a scientist, I mean, I knew about it quite in advance of when the official announcement was made. And I mean, one thing we might want to talk about tonight is embargoes and whether they're even a good idea. But and there's a lot of chatter amongst me and my colleagues, sort of, hey, have you heard about this? What do you think? Oh, I don't know. They're really pulling a lot out of like crappy data. But on the other hand, who knows? There was a lot of, like people do, in just amongst themselves in a sort of impolite way, already it was, people were kind of speculating about what it really meant and if they had really found what they thought. But then a group that I'm a member of, a research team, got a pre-briefing. We were sort of sworn to secrecy, but we got a briefing of the paper and from Dr. Greaves, Jane Greaves, who was the lead author on the paper. So before it had come out, I had heard her give a talk on the results and on what they did, and it's solid work. Whether or not it's going to hold up is a whole other question, and it's very much in flux right now, and honestly nobody knows, and there's been all kinds of complications. It turned out that the facility had a problem with the calibration of the data, and it's all got to go back and recalibrate, and there's a lot of issues, and it's honestly nobody knows if there's phosphine on Venus at this point. But it's not, I think, the arsenic life was sort of one extreme of how things can go wrong. Like you said, it was a young researcher. She was not treated well. The review process, I think, was flawed. And then people were really sort of mean to her when it turned out that there were mistakes made in this way that was really uncool. Some other scientists were just unnecessarily mean to her. This is not that. I think, for a number of reasons. For one thing, the lead author is an established scientist with a ton of, this is not going to ruin anybody's career, fortunately, however it turns out. And I think we should talk about, it's okay. Like, people can report things that turn out to be mistakes. And that doesn't have to be a catastrophe. There's a long history in science of people doing their best and reporting a result, and they get excited about it, and people get excited. And then it turns out they were wrong, but it's not that they were fraudulent or they did something horrible or anybody, it's like, that's how science works. And so there are different ways to be wrong, and arsenic is one thing. And if the phosphine turns out to be wrong, and I honestly don't know, and I don't think anybody knows at this point, but it could be, I think it's not going to be the same kind of story as the arsenic story.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, go ahead, Rebecca.
I was gonna say, I agree with that, and that's for a lot of reasons too. Like, as you said, that the researcher for Arsenic Life was like younger. Jane Greaves, the lead author on the Venus paper, is not, early career at all. She's extremely, well-respected scientist. I've talked to her for lots of stories over the years, and she's really, really smart. And that, honestly, seeing her name on that was one reason I was like, oh, she doesn't fool around, But yeah, this won't be the same sort of thing in that, like, it's going to become this personal battle and all that stuff, hopefully. It was my trepidation about it as a writer was more born of how people are going to read this, and what role I play and what responsibility I have in making sure that they don't get the wrong idea.
Yeah.
And for something like astrobiology, that is so hard. And like I said, I'm a freelancer. Like, I could have pitched someone about this Sunday when I saw the email, or whatever day it was now. It was like probably a Friday it came in. And I could have emailed my editors and been like, let me do this story. And I just didn't. And if somebody had emailed me and said, like, can you cover this? I probably would have said, okay. And then I would have found my way of doing it. It was more like a calculation I made as somebody fortunate enough to be able to do that as a freelancer, to say, like, I might sit this one out, and like maybe there's analysis stories to be done later that I think would be really interesting. There's, one of my friends, Sarah Scholes, is a freelancer who wrote a story for Wired on the discovery that I thought was fantastic, because she really had a story about the history of this discovery, how they arrived at this conclusion. The younger researcher who studies phosphine, how she was kind of brought into the fold. And that was such a good story to me, because it really told the story of this discovery, this claim, but also put it in very human and very processy terms, which I really appreciated, because I think readers need that stuff. Like, people don't always know how hard this stuff is and how long it takes and how careful people really are with it. And that was just one example of a person who I thought did a really good job with that uncertainty that's sort of inherent in these things.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me wonder too, like, how do you deal with that uncertainty in a field like astrobiology, or even in some ways in space in general? Like, when you are making these sort of calculations between, I know that the Venus story was a bit of an extreme example, but just like in general, like, how do you try to approach those kinds of pieces?
Are you asking me?
Sorry, either one of you. I mean, either whoever wants to take it first.
I mean, it's tricky. Our field is tricky because it's all about nuance. And when we find something we're excited by, we have to go in with the assumption that the reasons why we're excited about it are probably wrong. And like somebody thinks they found methane on Mars, and that's exciting because methane could be, if the methane is really on Mars, it's conceivable that it could be a biosignature, but there are all kinds of other things that it could be. So you want to be able to tell people, well, I'm excited about this discovery because it conceivably could be a biosignature, but you're worried that the only thing, 2 words they're going to hear is life and Mars.
Yes.
Yeah. And there's a lot of other words that really ought to be in there to contextualize why you're excited about it, but why you're not, sort of waiting for the Nobel committee to call you tomorrow, or shouting from the rooftops.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Rebecca.
No, I agree. Like, that's the hardest part of this beat sometimes is explaining to people how uncertain this inherently is and how uncertain it will probably always be, unless we are able to bring back some sample that is definitively sealed from Earth, and we can detect some sign of biology. And that's going to be so hard to do. With 5 sigma certainty, with like really, really well done, really certain science, which is sort of inherently contradictory, right? Like science is inherently about the process of figuring things out, and so there's never really the black and white answer. I happen to find that really fun as a writer. Like I like covering this in part because it's so liminal. Like you're never really on one side of it or the other. And that's just kind of challenging and compelling to write about. And as somebody who likes to think about those things, like I like inhabiting that kind of uncertain realm we're always going to be between yes and no. So I wrote this feature a couple of years ago for the Atlantic about kind of all of this, about astrobiology, generally, like what it is, how it works. And I went down to the Atacama Desert in Chile with these NASA scientists who were studying halophiles, which are these salt-loving archaea, and some of them are bacteria. And these are like, this environment is pretty equivalent to what we think is the last habitable environments of Mars, hundreds of millions of years ago, tens of millions of years ago. And so if we ever send people up there, or really well-equipped robots, this is the sort of science that we would be doing, and trying to find like lipids preserved in salts, and to argue that was at some point an organism that was metabolizing. And it's just like so hard to tell a story about that, because you're asking people to make these leaps in understanding, and you're trying to paint a scene that inherently is uncertain. So it's challenging, but I actually just find that really fun. Yeah, I don't know. I think I lost the thread of that question. Sorry, I'm just excited about this stuff.
That's exactly right.
But on the other hand, like I think sometimes we can. I would argue that sometimes we can almost be too careful because we're so worried about being misinterpreted. I did see there was a funny phenomenon with the Venus phosphine announcement, where, I mean, for one thing, I think that the researchers were pretty careful and responsible at their press conference. The very first slide, it said, "We are not saying we found life on Venus." I mean, if you turned in, those are the first words you saw. But on the sort of science and SciComm Twitterverse, there was a flurry of people freaking out that the story was going to be misinterpreted. Like I saw so many people saying, "Oh no, everybody's going to think that we're saying we found life on Venus. How could they? It's so irresponsible." Like I saw so many people worrying about that the communication was going to be bad. And then when I read the actual news stories, for the most part, I thought they were pretty good. For the most part, they said, possible sign of life, or there was, biogenic gas on Venus, ? They put in the question mark and they said possible. And if you read the story, they quoted somebody saying, "Well, we're not sure. It could be a lot of other things." Like, I mean, not every single story, but I thought for the most part, the reporting about it was pretty responsible. And I saw much more fretting about the possibility of people getting carried away in the wrong ways than I actually saw people getting carried away in the wrong ways. And I was wondering if part of that was a reaction to things that have happened in the past, like the arsenic life, where we really did kind of all blow it.
I think that's actually exactly right. Like I saw the same thing on Twitter. I saw a lot of scientists and even science writers sort of like preparing for like a bad rush of coverage. And I also thought for the most part that it was pretty straight ahead. Like, yeah, there were some bad apples, obviously, but like for the most part, everybody kind of stuck to the party line. Everyone had those modifiers in their headlines and all that stuff. And I think it's really interesting. Actually, Stephen Harris in the Q&A has a good question, but he was wondering how scientists and science writers, like how many of us are aware of these kinds of discoveries before the news actually breaks. So this might be a good opportunity to talk about how broken the embargo system is. maybe.
Yeah.
Because I would say, like, just to start off with, like, a lot of people know about these discoveries before they come out, and it is nearly impossible to keep them from breaking early. If that makes sense. Yeah. Whoever would like to take
I mean,
it.
I'm curious to see what David says about this too, because of the way that science works. But I mean, I think this works in a couple different ways. And one of them is the embargo system that allows journalists, but also, advocacy groups and public relations people, and sometimes even scientists, to see this stuff before it's published officially, because then they have time to, the point is that you have time to call people and vet the information and prepare a story so that no one is like the first out of the gate and people don't have to rush to keep up and then do a bad job. That's the argument I've understood it about embargoes. And, we can talk about whether that's bad or not. And there's also an element of it is that there's, beat reporters that are covering these things who go to meetings, and scientists who attend meetings, and they talk about these things, and they're collaborators, and there's Zoom calls, and there's Slack channels, and there's lots of little networks that people use to share this information. And something that rises to the level of this, the phosphine thing, which is such a huge claim, I think probably was maybe handled a little more quietly than a normal study, or a study that would have less of a splash. But for the most part, like, when a paper like this comes out, people know it's coming, and they've known for a while. And that includes, the scientists working on it, the, collaborators, the referees, the competitors, and the journalists. And so it is interesting to have this like cabal, like behind the scenes, that holds this knowledge until such time as Nature Astronomy deems it appropriate to tell everyone. There's this part of the system. I don't know how to fix that.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what the perfect system would be. I mean, it's a strange thing, because part of it is that the journal wants to make a big splash with their publication, and none of us are really opposed to that, in the sense that we're glad it gets covered. We're glad that there's a story in the New York Times, and you don't want your science, your field, to be ignored. So you like when there's sort of a splash and it gets out there, but it creates this sort of weird artificial hype, and this just kind of bizarre secrecy, and then it gets broken, and then I don't know, it's messy. And I'm not exactly contrasted to, 99% of our science isn't done that way, because it's not considered as exciting and important. And, it's just, what happens is you have a result and you talk about it at a meeting, and then, you get feedback, and then you publish it, and, maybe there's a press release, but, not that many people see it. And it feels sort of healthier, that. And there's something that feels kind of unhealthy about this, but I don't know how to sort of, you understand that they want to make some kind of a splash. But one thing that happens that really bothers me is that, like, I've had some papers that I've been author or co-author on that have been embargoed by Nature or Science, and they're really kind of jerks about it to the scientists, and that, like, you're not allowed to, like, talk about your results at a conference to other scientists beforehand. And then that gets really unnatural, because you go to a conference where your colleagues are talking about stuff that it would make sense to talk about your result in that conversation. And you're sort of been warned, well, if you do, then Nature's going to withdraw and not, like, do their big high profile publication. So you're sort of under this threat where you better not do the thing you normally do with your colleagues, or you're going to not get the big prize of the big publication in Nature. And I kind of hate that aspect of it.
Yeah, there's certainly, like, an ick factor to sort of having this this group of people who are like the holders of the knowledge ahead of time. Hi, Ivan. Ivan has joined.
I'm so glad Ivan's going to say something about this.
I'm so happy you're here, Ivan. Can you enlighten us about embargoes, please?
I don't know if enlighten is the right word. I think people have been listening to me, or avoiding listening to me, for too many years on embargoes. But David, I was just commenting on what you were saying. if you ask Nature, and even their policy officially says, no, we don't do that. You can talk the way we want you to be able to communicate with. But we all know that what they really do, even if it's not so much in an email, but sort of, nudging you so I think, again, I don't want to rehash, my many, painful years of thinking about embargoes, but there's all of the messiness that you've described, all of you, exactly. I think there's sort of larger issues, again, getting back to what David was saying about the control that the journals have. I mean, David, you're absolutely right. Like, a field shouldn't have any issue with, some kind of publicity kind of, if this is a way to do that. On the other hand, we as journalists, I would argue, should, I don't know, take some of it back and say, we want to report on what we want to report on. We don't want scientists to think, even if it's not the official policy, they can't talk to us, right? Because then you don't get into the, Rebecca, what you were talking about, the sort of the nitty gritty of how the process all works. You can only report when somebody's allowed to speak when it's published in Nature or wherever, right? But again, you've all heard me say this. A lot of people probably in the audience have heard me say this, but it's a pretty, use the polite word, but it's a pretty messed up system.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting too. I had a question about the archive on my list also. So there's sort of the repository for all of the preprint journal articles for astrophysics and astronomy. And I think a lot of journalists, myself included, kind of trawl it to see what's new and what's happening. And these are preprints, so they're not peer reviewed. Some of them have been accepted, some of them haven't, to journals. And I'm wondering how both of you engage with the archive. Like, Rebecca, do you use it to find stories?
Oh yeah, all the time. And
Yeah.
I mean, I would say, I'm doing less news nowadays than I have for the bulk of my freelancing career. But when I do, and when I've done news in the past, that's like the first place I look for stories, because a lot of times people will post stuff when it's been accepted, and so they're okay talking about it because it's going to be published, but it hasn't yet, and they're looking for kind of a backstop, comments from colleagues and people who might offer some advice or feedback that they want to have before the paper actually hits the journal, and so they'll talk to you most of the time. And yeah, but I have run into the issue of people being like, oh, well, it's not in a journal yet and I can't talk to you. And then I'm like, well, you posted it in a public forum, so the public can read it, and we're gonna do a story. You talk to me, and a lot of times they will, sometimes reluctantly, but sometimes they just won't, and that's always an interesting challenge. But yeah, I mean, it's a great place to look for news, and I always look there for stories. I mean, for background on stories I've been assigned or something I'm working on. That's the first place I search for, like, the history of the literature on some subject.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the archive. It's a great tool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the archive is an interesting sort of relatively new phenomenon in the whole ecosystem of science publishing. And in a way, it's almost like the opposite of the embargo problem. It's so unfiltered, and anybody can just put anything out there, which is fine, as long as you know how to read it and know what it means if something's just up on the archive and not yet peer reviewed and so forth. So it's a really valuable resource, certainly for scientists, and I think for journalists like Rebecca. But once in a while, of course, some journalist who either doesn't understand or is willfully ignoring the difference between something that's just up on the archive and something that's actually been peer reviewed will, you'll see some story that's very far-fetched, and you realize, oh, they're referencing this paper, and not everybody understands what the archive is and how it relates to the peer-reviewed literature. So that also introduces sort of a different kind of noise into the system.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So this is a little bit of a separate sort of question, but David, I'm really wondering, like, about some of the, if you've encountered some difficulties in your work, as far as, like, I don't know how to sort of ask this in a super polite way, but, like, do people always take you seriously? Like, do people take the work that you're doing that is like legitimate scientific inquiry? Like, when you're talking about astrobiology, is it something that you find people are very accepting of? Like, how have things, I guess, changed with perception?
I think there's a wide spectrum of responses. I think in general, overall, people engage with it pretty seriously and they're excited by it. And I'm pretty pleased with the reaction. But you got to be thick-skinned when anybody that does anything publicly, writing or science or whatever, knows that you have to, especially these days, has to be thick-skinned because you're going to get all kinds of reactions. And yeah, you get, there are, well, for one thing, there's a lot of kooky stuff you get. If you are at all public as an astrobiologist, you will get earnest screeds from people that need to tell you about their alien interactions they've had or their theories. You get a lot of theories, but as far as, and you get, of course you get skepticism, and that's okay. And you get some meanness. There are definitely people out there that that think what you do is inherently flaky, and that anybody talking about looking for extraterrestrial life is a flake, and that it's not serious science. There are people that think that. They're generally not that well informed. The ones that hurt are the people that are smart and well informed and think your ideas are flaky. You get some of that, but but by and large, I think that there's more positivity gained by the fact that it's sort of exciting, cutting edge science with some thrilling possibilities that we at least have some chance of uncovering. The net gain from that is more than the pain of being misunderstood or not taken seriously, which happens also.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I often wonder too, like sometimes when I'm talking to people about my work, a lot of people think like, oh, that's really cool. But then a lot of people are like, that seems like a fake job. So it's sort of, I'm always curious how that works with other people in space too. And then Rebecca, I was wondering, like, have you encountered any resistance from editors that you've pitched sort of about like even the legitimacy of astrobiology? Like, how do you sort of make that case that it should be covered?
I feel like that's changed even in the like 10 years that I've been writing about this stuff. Like earlier on, it was like still fringy, and SETI was kind of like little green men, look at these guys. Like people weren't really taking it seriously as a field of science. And then I don't know what changed, but I guess probably Kepler, the exoplanet, cornucopia that we have now, I think made it seem like, oh, there's every star has planets, and there's probably a lot of planets, and there's probably a lot of ones that are habitable or that have water or that are in some way amenable to life. And so then it became a lot less fringy because there's a lot of places where that seems legit. And so then it became easier to write about. It was like no longer this kind of like winky sci-fi, blend. And it became like, how do people actually do this work, and what does it mean? And this Atlantic story was an example of that, where I was like, I really wanted to write something about what it looks like to do astrobiology, because we're not going anywhere else. We see robots a few places in this solar system, but that's it. And Kepler is no longer functional, and the TESS satellite hadn't launched at that point, but is just starting out basically. And we don't have a whole lot of ways to look for life right now, despite how often we talk about it. It's the field has improved a lot, but it's still by no means is it a common thing to do, and it's not by any means an easy thing to do. And so I was just really interested in trying to describe what that work looks like. And a lot of it is just kind of building up a baseline and building up the knowledge that you need and the skills that you need to interpret the data. And
that's really, really unsexy. Like that's like super boring. If you're
Yeah,
just trying to tell somebody about it.
a lot of astrobiology involves exploring the Earth
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
and doing experiments on Earth so that you have some idea what you're looking for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, you know, breaking open rocks in the desert is not the most exciting thing, you know, to a lot of people. And I mean, I thought it was awesome, but like it's not like you're, you know, curing coronavirus or something, or that you're launching a rocket. It's very tedious, it's very time consuming, and it's really important.
Yeah.
But it's become a little bit easier to write about, just in terms of getting assignments.
Mhm.
I think because of exoplanets, like it's become so much more likely that we'll find something somewhere, and because of Mars and Venus, and
Yeah.
now Europa and Enceladus, these moons of the outer planets that are really tantalizing places to look. Like it's probably going to happen in our lifetimes, and
And over that decade that you're describing, also, Rebecca, the science of astrobiology has become a little bit more institutionalized and sort of
Yeah.
accepted within the wider fields of science. Uh, the real watershed where exobiology became astrobiology happened in the late 1990s, when all these things happened at once. There was the Mars rock, which we can talk about
yeah.
as another sort of case study
Whole thing.
of what was probably a mistake, but I would argue a really useful mistake, that spawned a whole interesting many interesting lines of work that continue on and expanded our imaginations about what was possible. But around the same time as that, there was the Galileo discovery, really, that Europa had an ocean, and the first exoplanets were found around that time, and extremophiles were happening. So there was a sort of explosion of things that made us realize it wasn't such a fringe pursuit, and NASA established the Astrobiology Institute, and it became a real field. But then there weren't any grad students trained in it. But now, 20 years later, there's been a generation of scientists who've had at least the early careers in the time when astrobiology has been a thing. So it's become much more socialized within science, and I think that's probably reflected also in those attitudes that you're describing, Rebecca, in journalism.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And sort of like, I think on that note, like, is there a way that you guys try to ground these sort of like really big picture, like, are we alone in the universe? Like, I don't know of a larger question than that. Like, are there ways that you always try to ground it in reality? Like, Rebecca, I know your work, like you always have these human stories that are very like compelling and very just like, normal, like scientists doing stuff. And I wonder if that's sort of like the kind of stuff you like reading, and if that's like really what you're looking for when you're working on the beat.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
Of course.
I mean, for me, it's like, it's funny because I actually am just really interested in the hard sciences part of it. Like, I'm like, oh, I want to hear about this quasar. I want to hear about this like crazy astrophysics discovery, platinum forming in a, binary neutron star or something. But the way to get people to notice that stuff is by people. And ultimately, astrobiology is about us. It's about, are we alone? Why are we here? Are we special? Are we unique? And it's looking like it's just getting harder to disprove that, which is really interesting. And I think a lot of my friends are like not into space, and a lot of my science writer friends especially are like, space is like so boring and like what a waste of money, and I'm always like, it's not about it's about us. Like this is the fundamental questions that are being asked here, and that we're trying to get better at asking are about us, and that's the heart of everything. And so that's the only way into it, I think, is like I might think of stars as having a lived experience, or like having a, character arc, because I'm weird like that. But most people don't. And what brings them into it is the other people who ask these questions. And, if you can really get at what drives those people, which is these fundamental questions, that's just inherently super compelling, I think. Like, this is the most profound things we can talk about.
Yeah. Sorry, Dan, did you have something to?
Yeah, I thought that was such a great answer,
Yeah,
Rebecca. It really
it's
was
really lovely.
poetic. And as an environmental writer, I find myself just compelled by uh, space stories in general, but astrobiology especially, because I'm so interested in biodiversity on Earth, and I just find it. I find the sort of connections between those two areas of journalism to be so strong, and it puzzles me that it's often presented as somehow as a trade-off when it's anything but a trade-off. And
Yes.
I wonder, how you guys approach that in your writing, and whether you sort of consciously look for, like Rebecca was saying, she looks for characters, but do you also look for sort of applications on Earth, applications to climate science, or to, I don't know, geoengineering, or whatever, endangered species. I mean, I'm not sure.
That's often how I pitch something, because I think that's an interesting way to get an editor interested and to get a reader interested is like, how do I correlate this, kind of pie in the sky thing to someone's lived experience? And, like, I'm pretty aware that like I'm competing for time that people have to read their phones only about certain numbers of topics and certain amounts of publications, and people are really busy, and like they're not going to care about the things that I care about unless I show them why they should care. And so, yeah, like sometimes the practical side is a way in. Um, but as a writer, I just not as interested in that stuff. I'm just more interested in the ideas, and like, why do we care about, planets around other stars? And that's not going to derive practical benefits to our lives, most likely. Like, maybe there's going to be some, really important telescope technology that could translate to some new optical imaging for cancer research or something. I've written about that kind of stuff, and that's NASA's pretty good about pointing those things out. They have an entire division dedicated to it's called Spinoff, and NASA will be happy to tell you about all those different things.
Always.
But I just
I mean,
personally am less drawn to that stuff. I just find the fundamental questions to be like so interesting by themselves.
yeah, I mean, it kind of depends what you mean by practical too, and it's I agree. I'm not as interested in space stories because we can invent new nonstick frying pans because astronauts use Teflon or whatever. Although that's part of it, but if by practical you mean helping to solve the problem of how to survive um, as a species on a finite planet, I suppose that's practical too. And when I give public talks about Venus, one of the things I stress is that the reason why we care is because we want to understand the Earth, and you can't understand something in a vacuum without having other examples of Earth-like planets. And if you want to understand climate change, you have to look at climate in the broader context. And we've learned so much about practical things that help us do better climate modeling and understand acid rain by studying Venus. And we discovered the problem in the ozone layer in part because we were studying the upper atmospheric chemistry of Venus. So you can give these examples of things that people care about. Like most people, at least when you give a science talk, most people there care about climate change and understand and can relate to the fact that we really have to understand the way the planet works. And one way to do that is to look at other planets. But when I talk about astrobiology, I tend to go to the motivations that are, these deep questions that we want to understand what we are and who we are and what we're doing in this universe. And, is life something that the universe actually makes as part of the process of making planets, or is it some weird fluke that's happened here on Earth? I mean, that's really a spiritual question that can be addressed through specific scientific projects that we're doing. And how many spiritual questions can you say, I could make progress on this through this research project? And so, I think there are ways to communicate about these things that people relate to.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. It's funny because I feel like I've been in a little bit of a bubble because I have my space newsletter where people like opt in, and I'm like, oh great, I can just sort of tell you the narrative of the star. Like this is makes my job a little bit easier. But then you look at like the wider world, and it's like, okay, I need to find like some more practical direction to take this. But yeah, Stephen has another question in the chat. So I'm just going to sort of read this one out. Have y'all decided the criteria required for any of us to report that the life has been discovered elsewhere? So basically, like, how would we know if it happened?
That's such a good question.
It's such a good question. It's something I think about
question.
all the time.
We're also conditioned to the arc of the story being somebody makes a discovery and then we figure out why it wasn't really life, and that's sort of the thing that we know how to do.
Yeah.
What do we do when it doesn't go away?
Yeah.
it really is life, or how could we be sure? And when do we say we're sure? And that's something scientists haven't figured out how to determine themselves, let alone the journalists figure out how to report it.
This is like an active area of discussion in science, as far as I know, from people that I talked to. Like so we've been on Mars now for 17 years continuously, starting with Spirit and Opportunity, and then Curiosity, and now on its way is the new one. And I've talked to some Mars scientists who have told me over the years, like, this molecule that we found and this hydrated mineral that we found, like, if we saw that on Earth, like, we would have no doubt that formed in the presence of life, that formed in the presence of microbial activity, or that, in some past environment, life was present. Mm-hmm. But you're talking about Mars. So no one's going to say that, even if they're probably pretty sure of it and they feel like it's a legitimate claim. Like, good luck getting them to say that on the record or in the scientific literature. And that's good, I think, because these are extraordinary claims, and the Carl Sagan line that requires extraordinary evidence. And I don't think anybody has really agreed on what that would look like. And I think we've been conditioned, as David said, to see these things as discoveries and then backtrack them. But we've also been conditioned to think of aliens as like humanoid caricatures, and that they're going to show up here and blast us or something. And all of science fiction has taught us that for the last century. And so it's really hard to walk away from that rubric of how people understand these things. And we're never going to get that. Like, I mean, let's be honest, that's never going to happen. Like, come on.
But I mean, we might get a very, very clear sign.
We might get a SETI sign, or we might get a little green microbe.
Yeah. I mean, we all kind of expect that we won't, but but the thing is, I mean, and this is something we talk about over and over again and have sessions at meetings. How do you define life, for one thing, since we only have one example? We can't even really define it. And how could you rigorously define something where you only have one example? And then how would we definitively recognize it? On the other hand, if we come around a corner on Mars and there's, something walking around, or we look at a microscope and there's like cells divided, one could imagine unequivocal evidence. It's just that the first evidence we get that might actually be life may not at all be unequivocal. It may be some chemical signature, which could have some other explanation, but seems pretty promising. And then you make a prediction, you look for other chemical signatures. And at what point do you say, that's it? We don't have a protocol for that, really.
No. It's fascinating to me because I think about it from like the sort of the beat writer perspective, where I'm just like, okay, if next week there's a nature study and it's like, there's a microbe, we found the microbe, like, but what is that? Like, is it a NASA press conference? Is it a freaking White House press conference, like the Allen Hill meteorite? Yeah. Like that was Clinton coming out and talking about it. So, I mean, this is, I love thinking about it, but it exhausts me.
I think the best example we do have is the Allen Hills thing. And that, of course, wasn't finding something alive, but it was, they legitimately thought they had found fossils on Mars, which is pretty exciting. And even that, merited a White House announcement. So one can extrapolate from that if scientists had legitimately believed that they had found living cells somewhere, that it would, that would be White House level.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and actually that's a really great sort of segue into a discussion a little bit of the Allen Hills situation. Because I mean, David, you were just saying, like, you had said that it was not life, but it was very useful. I mean, can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, what I meant by that is it changed the way, I think it sort of, I don't know about permanent, but in a lasting way, it changed the way that a lot of scientists think about the possibility of certainly of finding early life on Mars. That, it was reported in Science magazine in a peer-reviewed study that there were nanofossils found in a meteorite that came from Mars. And the meteorites really do come from Mars. That's confirmed, and we have good evidence for that. But this story of the nanofossils, and they had several independent lines of reasoning, chemical clues and electron microscope pictures with these little segmented things that looked like tiny little wormies, so it was visually compelling. And it was not a flaky study. Subsequently, it's been picked apart, and the preponderance of belief is that there are other non-biological explanations for all the things that they found, although it's not 100% definitive that they didn't find. It's just that's the weight of opinion. And certainly nobody would really believe it unless we went to Mars and found more of those, and there was, more supporting evidence. But what I mean when I say that it was useful, what I mean is that when that was reported, it got a lot of people to think about the possibility of finding fossils in a rock from Mars. And a lot of people who hadn't thought it through and thought it might be ridiculous on the face of it, they were forced to really think about it deeply. And a lot of people said, well, why not? Why couldn't we find something like that? What do we know about early Mars? The more we learn about it, was that it shared a lot of the environmental characteristics that we think were important in allowing the formation of life on early Earth. So that expanding people's mind and getting them to think, why not, is what I mean by it being useful. And in fact, it helped to start the Astrobiology Institute and the whole astrobiology enterprise, which has now become international and is ongoing. So it was useful in that sense. And when I think about this phosphine on Venus and how it might just go away because it's contentious and we're not sure it's really there and it's being reanalyzed, my wish for it, if it does go away, is that it would also be sort of if it is a mistake, that it would be a useful mistake. And that I think the clouds of Venus as an environment are a really interesting place that we need to study further. And I've been of the opinion that it's a plausible habitat for long before phosphine was reported. And that's not the primary reason why I think it's a plausible habitat that ought to be studied further. And I think it did get a lot of people to look at that and go, well, why not? And there's some answers to why not, like the freaking sulfuric acid. But on the other hand, there are energy sources and nutrients and flows and interesting things. And so if it shines a light on that and gets people to pay attention and think in new ways, even if it ultimately was not a valid detection, then it's not necessarily, it might be a net gain in that way.
Yeah. I mean, from a practical standpoint too, like it's possible that the phosphine discovery could, the NASA administrator, like Jim Bridenstine, tweeted the day that it happened. He was like, this is like, Venus is in the cards. Like Venus could be a place to study. And it's been 30 years since NASA has sent a dedicated probe to Venus. And then that's
by the way, there's a funny story about that, which is that my friends at the NASA centers on that day were all emailing and saying, we're not allowed to say anything about phosphine. Like NASA was telling people.
We do know, we are aware.
And it's definitely, I think, in response to what you were saying, to the whole arsenic life thing. They're like, we got to be careful. So all these people who work at NASA centers were like, well, we want to say things, but we're not allowed to say anything. Meanwhile, the guy at the top hadn't gotten the memo, and Bridenstine is tweeting, "This is great. Let's go to Venus."
That's amazing. That's that's pretty correct. Sounds right. And yeah, it was funny. The lockdown that NASA sort of put over, that was one of the more fascinating
So
things
you
that I will
guys,
remember.
when I said that, you guys both said, we know. Is that because you were like calling people and trying to get quotes
Oh,
and
yeah.
everybody
Yeah.
was saying we're not allowed to talk about it?
I think I got in just under the wire with a NASA scientist, and I was like, great, I got someone, and then ghosted with everybody else.
Yeah, they were
after that.
directly told not to talk to media.
That's
And
funny.
then they
So-
put out this weird press release that was like, this was not a NASA study.
Yeah,
And, we are not involved. Cool finding.
Yeah.
It was weird.
So
interesting.
you have to find people like me who are supported by NASA but don't actually work at a NASA center.
Yeah.
So they can't give us a gag order.
Yeah, you're gold for us, David. That's exactly right. Here we have a couple of other questions that I can ask. This is sort of related. So, you guys, we've been on the space beat for a long time. It might be too early to tell, but how will privatization sort of change missions, roles, or for NASA? How will it affect research and exploration? And David, we can start with you if that works.
Boy, that's a great question.
Yeah.
I thought for a long time, what was happening was that the private companies were just going to take over the routine, cargo service. Which is fine. NASA doesn't need to be a bus company. Let some company bring stuff up to orbit and back. And that NASA then would be able to focus on the stuff that only NASA does, the deep space, pure curiosity-driven research that, there's no profit motive. So we do it because the taxpayers think it's worth, hopefully, just satisfying our thirst for knowledge about the wider universe. And that made sense. But now it turns out there are some private foundations and individuals who are saying, we're going to send missions to other planets and search for life because we think it's cool. And in fact, just full disclosure, I'm actually working on a project now that is being funded by a private foundation to possibly send a mission to Venus to study the possibility of life in the clouds. So this is something that's really happening. And it's a whole different category because like this guy, our sponsor, he's not trying to make a profit. It's not like, somebody like even Elon Musk going to Mars, he thinks in the long run, there's money to be made, and it's a speculative investment, but there's a business plan where he's going to return a profit. But going to Venus to look for life, there's no profit motive. It's somebody wants to, if there may be ego involved. I want to be the guy that funds a discovery of life in the universe, and but it's different. It's not somebody trying to make money. So I think the answer to your question is that it's rapidly evolving the role of private organizations and private wealth in space exploration, and I'm kind of excited about it, but I'm also nervous about it too because it also could potentially be much less fettered by the constraints of things like planetary protection and worrying about, following laws and customs and rules, because who's gonna enforce it out on Venus, So
Yeah.
I'm sort of cautiously optimistic that there's more support from more places to support the kind of science I want to do, but I'm also not completely sure how that's all going to play out.
Yeah. Oh, Rebecca, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's interesting how much this has changed in the last 5 years too, I would say.
Oh yeah.
Probably 10 years ago, I would say that the commercial side of this is going to be about, like David said, the bus company, like SpaceX or Boeing or whatever, these companies sending up cargo ships to the space station, and then even cargo ships to the moon eventually, and putting up some kind of settlement up there. But in the last 5 years or so, it's been that still very much, but also then you have these people like Yuri Milner, this Russian techno billionaire who is funding all these different SETI projects looking for signals of life around other stars. He has this thing called Breakthrough Starshot that they're trying to send solar sails to the nearest star system, Alpha Centauri, and which is a collection of stars. And this guy is just somebody with money and has wants a quest for knowledge. He also funds the Breakthrough Prize, so he's invested in basic science as something that's just worth spending money on. But that's pretty recent, I think, and the lack of profit motive from that side is really interesting to me. Like that there's an obvious profit motive for like Boeing and the legacy companies and SpaceX sending these, machinery into orbit or even into deep space. NASA's always had contractors who build their ships. Like NASA doesn't build anything in-house. Lockheed builds it, and Ball Aerospace builds it. And NASA does the instruments, but they pay to have people build the ships, and then they put it on the rocket that they bought, and then they send it up. But the exploration side is relatively recent, and that's really interesting to me. And like, I'm not sure about the motivations of some of those funders, and yeah, I'm kind of also like cautiously optimistic about it as just somebody interested in these things, but I'm a little wary too, because like private equity or something, these people are not answerable to shareholders or the public in any way, and that makes me a little bit queasy.
Yeah, I mean, so David, I'm not sure if this is the program that you're involved in, but I spoke to Peter Beck from Rocket Lab, and they have a plan to sort of send a mission to Venus, and he had this plan pre-phosphine discovery, but he's pretty amped about it now, especially. And it was just really interesting talking to him, because like it's just like this project of love. He's just like, look, if I can do something to advance the hunt for life, I'm gonna do it. And I have a rocket company, so I can. So he like took one of their satellites off the line and one of their rockets, and it's like this whole dedicated project where he's like, this is like philanthropy to him. And I find that intersection really interesting, where like my work is philanthropy in some way. It's also, I love that you guys brought up the fact that like they're not really beholden to anybody. Like NASA uses the decadal surveys to sort of decide what missions they're going to fund and what the next 10 years of exploration and scientific inquiry is going to look like for the space agency. But these companies they don't have to do that. They have no real reason to do that, because it's like, oh, we can just like do something cool. And something that would advance things. So I understand like the cautious optimism there.
Well, in fact, I mean, I've spoken with both Peter Beck and Yuri Milner about their plans, and and they both express actually wanting to do things that NASA isn't doing. So it's not even that they're ignoring the decadal plan completely, as wanting to be complementary. And
interesting.
And I mean, that's a good attitude. And, I think those two individuals, and there are other people talking about getting into it too, but they seem to have the attitude of wanting to cooperate more than wanting to compete with NASA, which is a good sign.
Yeah.
Although who knows when the rubber hits the road, who they're going to really feel responsible to. So.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it's like there's this like worry about maybe having sort of a rush of missions and then not really have anything. And it's definitely an open sort of question these days. Yeah, here we have another question from Joanna, and that was Nicholas who asked that last one. So thank you for that one. So she says, I am interested in the feedback loop between science and science fiction. Do any of us have a favorite real life scientific theory inspired by fiction, or a favorite science fiction concept inspired by real research? An opportunity to talk about sci-fi. What could be bad? Whoever would like to go first. Or I can, because I do have one too.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, why don't you go?
Oh no, okay. Mine is ridiculous. So I have a deep love for the movie Jupiter Ascending, which I know is incredibly silly. I know it's not a very good movie, but I evangelized for it and stand by it. And I love science fiction that sort of takes like a real topic, a real idea, and sort of asks the question behind it. So basically the question first for Jupiter Ascending was, in an infinite universe with infinite possibilities, what do you need more of? And the answer is time. And I just think like that's sort of what space science in general has showed us. Like there are numerous planets with numerous crazy places that we could all like see if we had the time and the ambition. And I don't know, I just watch the movie. It's dumb, but it's great.
That's
Cool.
awesome.
Yeah. Well, there's a definite feedback there, especially in a field like astrobiology, where we have to be careful in astrobiology not to think too narrowly, because we do have this one example of life, which is terrestrial life, and we don't know what we can extrapolate from life here to other life. So we have these ideas, it probably use organic chemistry, maybe to use some of the same organic that we use, but we really don't know, what life as we don't know it would be like, or if there can be life as we don't know it. And so the science fiction writers are not constrained the way we are to, they're allowed to let their imaginations run much more wild, and they can actually sort of help us as scientists to remember that we really don't know what the possibilities are out there. And I'll tell you one fun historical example. One of my first jobs as an undergraduate was working summers in Carl Sagan's lab at Cornell, and he had this planetary simulation laboratory where he was doing experiments that are sort of like the Miller-Urey experiment, where they mixed organic stuff and zapped them and tried to make organics, but it was next generation stuff where he was trying to simulate the organic evolution on Titan and other places. And so there were all these flasks of organic stuff, and they're being zapped in different ways. And Carl actually gave me a copy of what he told me was his favorite science fiction story. And it's a story by Theodore Sturgeon called Microcosmic God, about this. It's a really cool story about this scientist who creates life in the laboratory. And then of course things go wrong, but because it's a story. But it was just, here we are zapping things in the lab to try to simulate the early steps of life. And Carl tells me, oh, here's this story that I love that was written in the 50s or something, about this guy making life in the laboratory. And one other story, if I can quickly, the feedback goes both ways, in that sometimes science fiction writers tell you that they've been inspired by your science, and that's fun when it happens. And when my first book, Venus Revealed, came out, there was a lot of speculative stuff in there actually about possible life in the clouds of Venus and other stuff. And two different science fiction authors wrote Venus-based novels and acknowledged me and my work in helping them come up with ideas for their books. And as a lifelong science fiction fan who grew up reading that stuff and went into astrobiology partly because I was inspired by science fiction stories, to realize that writers had then looked at my science and gone off and written stories, it felt very satisfying in this kind of there is a feedback there.
That's so cool. Rebecca, do you have, just a favorite sci-fi, even if it's...
Star Wars has always been my favorite since I was a kid. And like, that's one reason I was so drawn to exoplanets when they first started being announced, because it was like, I knew it. George Lucas was right. Look at how many there are. And there was one that was even like Tatooine. It had 2 suns. And yeah, Star Wars has always been my kind of like, or science fiction.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how like exoplanet scientists are always referring to Star Wars, and they're like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, this one's like the ice planet of Hoth.
Yep.
It's like that's our reference point for different kinds of planets.
Like Tatooine planets, that's become like a thing.
Yeah.
What people are talking about when you say a Tatooine planet. It's really fun. Great. Let me see if I had anything else, but honestly, this was a blast.
This is really great. I have a couple of quick comments, and for me, I have never been more excited about space news as I was when the exoplanet stuff started exploding. I thought that was way more interesting, even than watching the moon landings when I was a kid, just because of the incredible diversity that's out there, and we can actually start to imagine what these places look like. And I just found that thrilling. And I think it's been amazing as a person who's not on the space beat, but has sort of, read space stories. I find myself just so compelled by the exo stories in ways that I'm just not as much for conventional exploration. I don't know.
Yeah, I am too. And like, it's been funny because I started freelancing in 2009, and that's when Kepler was launched, or maybe launched in 2008, but it started making its discoveries in 2009. And so the earliest part of my science writing career was covering these exoplanet findings from the Kepler Space Telescope. And it was like they just kept coming. And after a few months, I was at Popular Science at this point, full time, like as a freelancer, but kind of hybrid. And I covered so many Kepler papers and announcements. And after like 6 months of like the most yet, or the most Earth-like yet, you know, they were like, still more excellent. So it's been really funny to watch this whole thing evolve from this like shocking display of volume and, you know, everywhere, there's planets everywhere, every star has planets, and that still blows my mind, to now you talk about it and people are like, oh yeah, that one. It's like not even a surprise anymore. And it's that's only been in the last decade. And that's crazy to me that like exoplanets are now humdrum.
Yeah.
It is crazy. You know, I went to I finished grad school. I got my PhD sort of right before the exoplanet revolution. And so when I was at grad school and learning planetary physics and learning about planetary formation, we were taught, you know, here's how the solar system formed. Here's the process of accretion and chemical differentiation and all this stuff. Here's how you get from a molecular cloud to a sun-like star with planets around it. And most likely this is a common occurrence because the sun seems like a normal star. And so we expect that there are many solar systems that have these qualities. And so exoplanets were this expected thing. We were taught there's surely planets around other stars. So we expected them. We all believed in them, but we had zero evidence. So, you know, and then a few years later, you know, when I was a postdoc, there were the first announcements, and Bill Barucki was there trying to get Kepler launched, and then Kepler launched, and now there's there's billions and billions of exoplanets, and it's been amazing to see that unfold and to see that the diversity has been surprising, of course, and delightful. But it's also a basic confirmation. The fact that they're there and the numbers they are is a basic confirmation of this belief we had that was based on extrapolation from the local example. And I often think about that when I think about extraterrestrial life, because now that has the same status that exoplanets had when I was in grad school, that based on the local example, we believe, we extrapolate, and we think that it's common in the universe, but in fact, we have not observed it at all. So exoplanets went from that category in the last 20 years, really, to this widely observed thing. And now the question is, will that belief in widespread life based on extrapolation from the local example in the next 20 years, is that going to go through a similar, transformation? And that's, that's what has me on the edge of my seat.
That'd be cool.
Yeah, same. That's cool.
This
Yeah.
is a wonderful example of how just when we think that, you know, an entire field of science is static and that, you know, we know what we know, suddenly something amazing happens. And in this case, of course, they were always there. We just couldn't see them. And now we can. And I just find that thrilling. I find that thrilling for so many reasons. Well, this has been fantastic. Before we say goodbye, I just want to associate myself with the remarks of the gentlewoman from Tennessee on Jupiter ascending. I once watched it. I stumbled on it by accident, which I think is really the only way that anyone ever watches Jupiter ascending. And
unless you go to the theater the first weekend it's available.
oh my God, Miriam,
it's okay. I'm just saying, whatever, you know.
You do have a problem.
I do.
Anyway, Mila Kunis was running around. I'm like, okay, I'm in. And it was, let's just say it was awfully good, if you know what I mean. It was awfully good. And this was not even awfully good. It was just plain really good. So thank you all very much. Very grateful to Rebecca and David, and to Miriam for her amazing moderating, organizing abilities. And to everyone out there, we'll see you again in the spring, hopefully soon in person. In the meantime, be safe, be careful. We got to deal with the microbes we got here on this planet before we have the pleasure of encountering microbes in other places. So thank you all very much for watching. And if you want to see this again, you'll be able to see it online at journalism.nyu.edu/KC. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Very
This was
much.
fun.
Yeah.
Guys, that was great.